How good is this fabric? I've been really into the idea of big and bold prints lately. I bought this seersucker earlier this summer when Spoonflower was having a huge sale. They just started carrying seersucker as one of their base fabrics, which I was ecstatic about because it's one of my favorite fabrics for summer. But it's been so hard to find in modern fabrics in a great print. So I'm going to use this to make a Paper Theory pattern Zadie jumpsuit. It's kind of outside of my normal style preference, but I made one a few years ago in a vintage seersucker fabric, and I love it. I wear it all the time in summer. It's a modern pattern, but with a definite 1930s beach pajamas vibe. And I think it's going to be amazing in this seersucker fabric, so let's go make it. So let's talk about this pattern and the fit for a second before I cut things out. This is obviously not meant to be a really fitted garment, so at the time I sewed my original one, I wanted the bodice at least to have a little bit less ease than the pattern intended to give it more of a vintage feel. I'll pop it up on the screen again so you can see what I mean. So going by the body measurements chart, I decided to cut a full size and a half down from where my measurements would have landed me. And I say a half size since I was between sizes with my waist and my hip. This was a brilliant plan and I absolutely love how it fits me. So just a tip for you if you're looking to make this jumpsuit too and you want a little bit more of a vintage look for yourself with a little bit less ease. Now because I'm short-waisted, I also shortened the bodice a full 1.5 inches, which is pretty typical of an adjustment for me. I did compare this, even though I didn't do a muslin because I didn't feel like doing a muslin for a jumpsuit. I did compare this with other cut-on sleeve bodices that I have for dresses, just to get an idea if that would be a suitable length to shorten this. And I decided that the crotch length was longer than I wanted, which ironically is a hallmark of vintage sewing patterns, but it just seemed too long for me, so I shortened that by 1.5 inches originally too. And after I made my first one, I did decide that it was a bit short in the rise when I leaned over, which is obviously one of the reasons for a jumpsuit to have a longer crotch length. So I added a 1/2 inch back to this before I start this one, so we'll see if that suits me going forward. Who knows, I may end up lengthening this a little bit if I make this again in the future. And I did also shorten the hem length just a little bit. I folded it up about 1 inch. But of course, because I shortened the rise, that also shortened the leg, and I wanted more of a cropped leg length. And last but not least, in terms of alterations, I didn't want to bind the front open V-neck edge of the jumpsuit with bias tape. Instead, I just wanted to use single fold bias tape as a facing on the inside. I added a 1/4 inch seam line on the center front, and then also the back neckline. So except for the extra 1/2 inch in the rise for the crotch length, I'm cutting this out exactly like I did last time. And on to cutting. You know me, I almost always cut out on one layer of fabric, ignoring the cutting layout of my pattern completely. But interestingly, to help conserve fabric, the Zadie jumpsuit pattern is actually meant to cut on one layer, and they provide different cutting layouts based on a couple of different sizes, which I think is a really nice touch. I will say I didn't completely follow it, even though I had no intention of trying to match this large-scale print anywhere at all, making this a lot easier. I did want to make sure that I liked the blocks of color or pattern on the bodice pieces, so I needed to move them around a little bit. Then first up was pinning and basting all of the pleats, and there are a lot on this jumpsuit. No darts though, just soft pleats. I also took the opportunity to sew the 2 waist ties and turn them inside out. I always press open one side of the seam allowance first before turning a tube, just to make it a little bit easier to press once it's right side out. And then I pinned and sewed the shoulders next. Normally I'd be trying to batch up as much as I could, like I did with the belt and all the pleats, but there's a lot going on in this pattern, so I'm mostly just sticking to the construction order. But before sewing the bodice side seams, I pressed up the hem sleeve allowance, since it's a simple turned up hem, just to give it a bit of a memory crease to help me later on. For the side seams, since this is a jumpsuit that closes with waist ties, in the pattern you leave the right side open a couple of inches at the bottom when you sew the side seam. So you sew up to a dot that you mark, which I put a pin in when I was pinning everything so that I wouldn't forget and zip right past it when I was sewing it. The pattern calls for you to press the side seams open, and I'll tell you I do not like to do that on cut-on sleeves personally, so instead I just clipped above the open side seam on the right side to finish the side seams together above that point. And then you just fold under the seam allowances on the little open part to make a nice little top stitched opening for the tie belt. And it makes this nice little small opening for the tie belt. I also back stitched quite a bit, just since this is an area of stress, and use smaller stitches at the top edge when I was top stitching. So here is what the bodice is looking like so far. The side seams are done with the right side open where it will join the waistband. And I've just hemmed the sleeves, which I forgot was super annoying with this tiny little seam allowance. I might just use bias tape as a facing next time. I am loving how this bodice looks, and I was thinking well ahead of myself for this outfit because I was already planning earring colors to wear with this before I even started it. You know, I've mentioned I've been making resin jewelry for myself on and off over the years, and this year I've gone hard for earrings, and I've been designing pieces that I later make molds of. So here are a few example pieces of tops for earrings and bottoms for earrings that I might combine to make some earrings that'll match this jumpsuit. They actually stopped making the resin that I used to really love, and I haven't been that pleased with the one that I got as a replacement. It tends to get a few more bubbles, but you know what? It's part of the reason that I enjoy this. It's an area where I get to let go some of my perfectionist tendencies. The pieces are frequently not perfect, and sometimes colors end up different than what I was trying for. It's always kind of an experiment, and it's a fun meetup of science and art. And I really love flexing a different kind of creative part of my brain on these. Speaking of resin, I've been wanting to level up my skills in Inkscape lately. I use it to convert my hand-drawn designs into vector art, so I can get that printed in acrylic, and then make a silicone mold of that, and then cast resin pieces. And then I can make my own earrings like these. But I really only know how to scratch the surface with Inkscape. That's why I'm excited to partner with Skillshare, the largest online learning community for creatives. Skillshare offers thousands of classes led by industry experts on everything from design and illustration to film and video, and yes, even crafts like resin, jewelry making, and sewing. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting out, Skillshare has something for everyone. I'm taking their class Inkscape Quick Start to learn a little bit more about this software rather than just hacking my way through it. I'm learning so many tips and tricks that I can apply to my work, and already 2 minutes in, I was like, I didn't know I could do that. Skillshare also has curated learning paths to help you master specific skills in a sequential set of classes. There's even one on growing your first YouTube channel, which covers everything from literally how to start, all the way to learning video editing in DaVinci Resolve, which is the software I use for my videos. If you're looking to take your creative skills to the next level and beyond, because you can seriously learn it all here, then check out Skillshare. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial to Skillshare. Explore all the classes you want and master something new. So what are you waiting for? It's time to turn I want to try into I made that happen. Thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now back to the jumpsuit. So prepping the front slash pockets is next, and this is where I added a little extra insurance into this seam line compared to the pattern. I'm using seersucker, which is a very lightweight fabric, and this is on the bias. And as a pocket, I just thought, boy, that's really going to be prone to stretch. So when I made my original one, I used stay tape in that seam line. And so I'm going to do the same thing for this one as well. Let's get this lined up. And I'll just add that right in the seam line here, and that will give it a little extra stability. And you also understitch this as well, and you can watch my understitching video, which I just did, if you'd like to learn more about the importance of understitching. I sewed the slash pocket seam with that added stay tape next, which made a nice stable seam on the bias. You understitch that seam next, and then press it towards the inside of the garment since it's the pocket. This fabric is looking so good, by the way. I'm already super excited about this jumpsuit. And then you just pin and sew the bottom edge of the pocket bag. Slash front or curved front pockets like on jeans are always a little bit weird when you are assembling them because you're kind of like, what is going on here? But basically what I have here is my seam from the pocket bag to the front leg, and that is understitched. And then the bottom edge is sewed, and then I serged it. If you didn't have a serger, you could actually sew this inside out so that the raw edge was on the inside of the pocket bag if you wanted. And all I have to do here is fold this over and line everything up along the side seam and along the top edge carefully. And then baste that in place, and I have my front leg piece with my nice little pocket. Just take your time when you pin before basting the side seam of the pocket to the leg and the top edge of the pocket to the leg, since you want to make sure everything is laying nice and flat with that pocket bag. These legs have a loose fit, but it can look a little bit wonky in a more fitted leg if you're not careful here. After I basted the pocket bags, I could start assembling the legs. Like I said earlier, I'm mostly following the construction order here, so I'm assembling the pant legs like the pattern instead of how I'd normally do it. So each leg is sewed individually first. For both legs, the back and front are pinned and then sewed together along both the inseam and the side seam. And you finish the seam allowances and press them, and then you get to assemble them together. You stick one leg inside the other leg with the right sides of the fabric together and pin and sew the crotch seam. But since this overlaps at the front, you have to actually stop sewing at a marking about halfway up the front crotch. You'll also then only finish the seam allowance on the back, but stop just before the front, since you'll finish that off later after you do the bias binding, or in my case, bias tape facing. And now that the crotch seam is done, I can assemble my bodice to my pants. But you can still see that I have my one leg inside the other leg, looking at the pocket bag of one of the legs, and I will turn this all right side out and start assembling. So pull one leg out from the other leg, and where are we? Here we go. Okay. Do they look like clown pants? Maybe. Do I care? Absolutely not. This is going to be amazing. Okay, so here's my right side out pants with my lovely little slash pockets and the front overlap bit on the pants and the overlap bits on the front of the bodice. And this pattern has what I think is very helpful. A nice little drawing of what the intersection of the bodice and the pants are on the right side of the body, where you have the little hole for the waist tie. And you can see the slash front pocket, and I like that it shows the back body, front leg, front leg. I think this is a nice little drawing in here to help orient yourself. So when I assemble this, basically, I probably should have basted across this. I bet the pattern told me to, and I didn't do this. I may just go do that. Baste across this for when you attach it to the leg, and I'm going to assemble this all now. Okay, actually I checked the pattern and it doesn't tell you to baste the lower edge of the waist tie opening, but here's my old one, and the opening is really right up to the seam, so I am going to actually baste that because I think it probably just makes it a little bit easier to sew this and not have this flare open when you attach it to the side seam. So I'm going to do that and then pin this all together. Pinning and sewing the bodice to the pants was easy, and all the pleats on the bodice and pants together lined up perfectly, which is always nice. There are quite a few layers at some points in the seam allowances between the pocket bag and the pleats, but I'm using such a nice lightweight fabric that it's all fine. And then I just needed to make my bias tape that I'll be using as a facing instead of binding the edge. So my bodice and my pants are now joined, and I have myself a jumpsuit. I just have to do all the finishing things. And since I did the annoying sleeve hems earlier, all that is hemming the legs and doing the bias tape around the front neckline opening towards the crotch. First, you have to baste on the waist ties, however. So I have them pinned and they just line up right at the waistline seam. I actually overlapped the very end of it into the pants just slightly because this is meant for double fold bias tape to bind the edge, and that's probably constructed in a little bit of a different way, and I'm using my single fold bias tape that I made. And so I have a narrow, kind of scant 1/4 inch seam allowance here, and when that turns under, I want that to more or less line up with the waistline seam. I mean, it doesn't really matter very much. You're going to have ties around this. No one's going to see that, but that's the idea, that it'll line up about there. So I'm going to baste those on, and then I can start attaching my bias tape, which may take a little bit of work. Pinning the bias tape starts at the opening at the overlap of the pants and up and around the waist where the tie is and around to the other side around the neck. Again, I'm doing a bias tape facing here and not binding the edge, so I'm pinning my bias tape right sides together to the jumpsuit, and then I'll fold it to the inside and top stitch. Now the really curved part where the tie belt is attached is kind of tricky, so I decided, you know what, let me draw the seam line onto the bias tape in this little area so I can more easily see it as I'm sewing this spot. Because the waist tie areas is such a steep outside curve, I did stretch the bias tape a little, so there's less tape to fold to the inside, but I didn't bother pressing it into a curve or anything, so I had a little excess on this free edge. But you know what? That is what a little tuck is for, and it's on the inside so no one will see, so it doesn't bother me at all. I've actually done this for V-necks too. Are you supposed to do it that way? Nope. Do I care? Nope. I pressed the bias tape away from the bodice before folding it to the inside and pressing it. Normally, I would plan to top stitch bias tape actually from the inside with an edge stitch foot on a smaller area, but this is a lot of bias tape here and it's very visible, plus those curved waist tie spots, so I wanted to make sure my top stitching was really even from the outside of the garment, so I lined it up from the right side. So this turned out nice, just like on the pattern envelope art. And the part that is a little bit weird at the end is right where I left things open per the pattern at the end of the bias binding, or in my case bias tape, to finish off this crotch seam allowance. And I couldn't really figure out how to do this well the first time, and so what I did this time, I think this will work, is I tapered my line of stitching for the top stitching around the bias tape. I tapered it to where I had ended my stitching originally. And I'm going to attempt to sort of taper off the bias tape off to get cut off with the serger. But basically, I'm going to just go back over this last little line of stitching to the edge here, because I think that's sort of what you're supposed to do with the serger. I don't know. I'm going to make this up. It doesn't really matter. This is going to be overlapped at the crotch anyway, so no one's really going to see that. But that's what I'm going to try. Hopefully that will work out okay, and we'll see. So I basted that first just to check, and initially I thought maybe I shouldn't extend the stitching line to the raw edge since the overlap has to be pressed and fold over, but after serging I realized it has to, or you see the serger stitching and it may be an area of stress, so I just ran my line of stitching right next to the serger thread to meet back up with the seam line. And that worked out great. The pattern has you press where the bias tape meets the crotch anyway, and I think this worked out perfectly. And the only thing left at this point is a simple turned up hem. I think I did 1 1/4 inch on my first pair, but since I lengthened the rise back again by 1/2 inch, I just went with the original 1 1/2 inch hem. That's the perfect crop length for me for this. I will say, even with my bias tape modification, I think this pattern comes together pretty easily and quickly. The Spoonflower seersucker was lovely to work with for this project. It's one of my favorite types of fabrics, so I'm thrilled that they're carrying it as an option now. Something to get more of during the next sale. And this modernist inspired print is so good, and I love how this jumpsuit turned out. It's bold, it's loud, the earrings I made pair perfectly. Just add a tilt hat and it's my take on modern meets 1930s French Riviera fashion. And I'm basically over the moon about this project. Check out one of these other 2 videos and I'll see you again soon with more vintage sewing.